Welcome to the Compliance Resource Center How to Set Up Your Site series. In this presentation, we're going to review site navigation and site structure. First, we'll introduce you to some common SharePoint conventions. Then we will go over roles and permissions and appointing those permissions. Finally, we'll explain the security matrix that we use to assign user permissions. So let's start with some SharePoint conventions. A list. What's a list? Have you ever used Excel or Access or Microsoft Word? You've probably worked with a worksheet or tables. Let me show you. Let's open up Excel, and I've started out by setting up columns here. I did this because I want to start managing tasks right here. So I'd create my task name column, I'd create who it's assigned to, the start date, the due date. And SharePoint lists are very similar to Excel. Let's look. You'll see they have the columns. Each of these columns is exactly the same. So why would we use a SharePoint list over an Excel? Well, first of all, it's web-based. Anyone who has a CAL or a login can access it through any browser anywhere. A list has the ability to be used in other lists and libraries. There is versioning, which allows us to recuperate a single task and bring it back to a certain date. Lists have the ability to include content, and the list can also require content approval before an item is visible on the list. So those are some of the benefits of using a list instead of using Excel. And you noticed I pointed out the columns in a list. Columns are what make up the list. So let's look at an example from SharePoint where we were before. You'll notice in this task list that we were using before that there is now an extra column, program name. And this would be done because you want some additional information about the task that needs to be done. So you add an extra column, which, like we said, the columns make up the list. Those columns are often referred to as metadata. So, another term is a library. What's a library? A library is essentially another form of a list. So, what's the difference? The content associated with the list determines if it's a list or a library. Generally, lists are more data-focused, whereas libraries are more document-focused. Items. A list can be thought of as a collection of pieces of information, all of which typically have the same properties. So these pieces of information are items. Let's look. Right now, we are in the policy document list on the CRC. And you'll notice that in this list, all of the different policies are listed. Right here, their titles, and then there's different information about them. But you could say that each one of these rows would be an item. And if you wanted to add a new policy to the list, you would be adding a new item. And you'd click right up here, new item. And this little form comes up, and you would title the policy, and you would have to fill out the must-fill fields, which always will have this little red asterisk by it. Usually these are indications of important information that really identify the item, and you could attach your policy right up here. And when you're done, you could just do save. But going back to the PowerPoint, another term commonly used in SharePoint are views. Views are the visual representation of SharePoint data. Views are created by displaying columns in a specified order. Basically, you can sort the columns in alphabetical or numerical order. You can filter so that only certain items in a column will show up. Here, let me show you. Let's go over to our site. So if we wanted to alter the view, we would go to List Tools and Modify View. And here you can decide which items or which columns, which metadata about each item is going to be shown. So like if you didn't want the start date to be shown, you could just unclick that right there. You could sort the due date. Where's that? Or you could sort the program name in ascending order. Then you could filter to, right now the default is to show everything in the list, but if you only wanted the things that are assigned to Julia Buttery to show, let's make sure I didn't put 2 spaces in there. I did not. You can say OK. So now, because I put it to only things that Julia Buttery has done as the view, it actually made it to where all the other settings didn't even matter that I set. So if we go back to List, Modify View, and we just say show all items in this view, and we'll still do that. But then we'll be able to see that the program name is going to be alphabetical, and the start date shouldn't be there. So you'll see it's alphabetical, and there's no start date for that. Another great feature of SharePoint is surveys. We're using surveys for internal audits. The benefits of using SharePoint for audits is that they can be completed by anyone, anywhere who has a web browser. Even mobile devices work with SharePoint. The responses can be named or they can be anonymous. These are real time. And you can use the audit with great analysis tools. Now let's go over who will be using your agency's Compliance Resource Center and what they'll be doing. Not all lists and libraries are relevant to all employees. So SharePoint gives you the ability to limit access to lists and libraries. You also have the ability to grant different levels of permissions within individual lists and libraries. So if you had somebody that you wanted to be able to edit policies, but you didn't want them to be able to edit licenses, you can set that up. It's all done by each individual list. And you can also grant somebody, maybe in that example from before, to still see the licenses, but they could only view the licenses, but not actually edit them. Your organization should designate 1 or 2 site administrators who can access all lists and libraries with the highest level of permission. The site administrator will have the ability to alter any user's permissions when necessary. Within each list and library, you create groups of users based on permissions. These permissions determine how a group of users can interact with the items in a list or a library. So the general groups of permissions are within a list that users could only view the items in the list. Then there's users who can view and add content to a list. Next, there are users who can view, add, and edit content in a list. And then finally, there are users who can view, add, edit, and modify formats within a list. Generally, in that last one, that would just be for site admins. So now we'll discuss CALs, or Client Access License, which is a license that gives the user the right to access the services of the server. A CAL has to be purchased for every user who accesses the server. When you assign permissions to a user, you're actually assigning permissions to that person's CAL. A CAL can be thought of as a login, I guess. So you wouldn't want to have to purchase a CAL for every member of your organization. Not everybody's going to be using SharePoint, but you can do a guest CAL, which can be used by any member of your organization who knows the username and password. The guest CAL in our instance is set up to have view-only permissions in not very many lists, just the organizational chart, policy documents, and compliance activity list. So now your organization needs to think about which employees need to access your SharePoint site, and what you should do is use the security matrix Excel spreadsheet that we have provided in the resources section of this course, and I will show you what you need to do. So in the security matrix, make sure you're on the tab of the security matrix in this Excel workbook, and you'll see each of the libraries and lists are listed right here. Compliance risks, policy documents, org chart, compliance activities. And underneath them are the different groups of permissions that are associated with that list. So for org chart, there are people who can only view the org chart. Then there are people who have the highest permissions, which are usually the site admins. Let's go to one where people can actually edit a little bit more. Policies, right down here. So first there's members who can view and add policies to the list, but they can't edit those policies once they're there. They have the approver groups, the people who would need to approve any policies that are added up there. And then there's people who can edit and people who can view only. The default CAL, the guest CAL, because we always want to make sure that our employees can access our policies. So you would have to go through for each list: org chart, compliance activity, compliance risks, policy documents, policy development, investigation, complaints, BA agreement, contracts, licenses, and proof. And then, over to the right, you start listing the people who you want to be in a certain group. So, in compliance, or let's see, in BA agreement, right here, you have the site administrators who can add, edit, modify formats, but then you have only certain people can view the business associates agreements. So those people are all listed in this row, right here. And then you have members who can view and edit the items in the business associates agreements. So you have to think this through, who you want to be accessing your site.